It is rare for a Treasury Secretary to describe financial pressure in language that sounds less like macroeconomics and more like siege warfare. But that is exactly what happened. In February, Scott Bessent said Treasury had created a dollar shortage inside Iran, that one of the country's largest banks then failed, that the currency went into freefall, inflation exploded, and protests followed. That is not a neutral description of sanctions. It is a description of economic coercion working as intended. And that is why this story matters now. Because by April, the same administration was not only talking openly about pressure on Iran's financial system, it was expanding sanctions on Iranian oil transport, threatening secondary sanctions on foreign buyers and banks, and using waivers and non-waivers as tactical tools to manage the fallout. Treasury was no longer sitting behind the battlefield. It was acting like part of the battlefield itself. The easy version of this story is that Washington weaponized the dollar. True, but incomplete. The harder version is that the United States is trying to turn control over the financial plumbing of global trade into a form of strategic pressure precise enough to hit adversaries, flexible enough to calm markets when needed, and public enough to warn every bank and shipping intermediary watching. That is a much more serious development. If you want clear, fast breakdowns of the hidden systems shaping global power, subscribe to Signal Drop now, because this story is not just about Iran. It is about how war is increasingly being fought through finance. And there is a contradiction sitting right at the center of it. On April 15th, Bessent said the U.S. would not renew general licenses on Iranian and Russian oil that had been used to keep more crude in the market. 2 days later, Reuters reported that Washington reversed course on Russian oil and renewed that waiver through May 16th after pressure from countries hammered by war-driven energy prices. The pressure campaign is real, so are its limits. That contradiction is the whole theme in miniature. Treasury wants to tighten the noose on Iran's revenue, banking access, and commercial networks, but it also knows that a sanctions regime severe enough to hurt Tehran can ricochet back into energy prices, allied politics, and the global economy. So what looks from a distance like total economic war is, in practice, a balancing act between punishment and market stabilization. The bigger strategic shift is this. Sanctions are no longer being presented as background pressure that quietly accumulates over time. They are being described as direct instruments of campaign design. Treasury is targeting shipping networks, shadow banks, oil waivers, correspondent banking risk, and foreign institutions that touch Iranian money. The object is not simply to signal disapproval, it is to narrow the adversary's room to breathe. That makes this a story about infrastructure more than ideology. Modern economic warfare runs through banks, insurers, shippers, commodity traders, and reserve currency settlement systems. If Washington can make those channels too dangerous to use, it can starve an adversary of liquidity long before the military question is settled. That is why Treasury matters so much here. It sits on the valves. But the script also has to stay honest. Iran's economic distress is not a one-variable equation caused only by Washington. Reuters reported in January that protests spread amid rocketing inflation driven by both Western sanctions and Iranian mismanagement, as well as wider political and social repression. So the defensible claim is not that Treasury alone collapsed Iran. It is that Treasury deliberately intensified the squeeze and publicly took credit for part of the result. Start with the baseline. On January 8th, Reuters quoted Bessent saying Iran's economy was on the ropes and described nationwide protests that had started in Tehran's bazaar over the plunging value of the currency and soaring inflation. Rights groups cited by Reuters said at least 25 people had been killed in the first 9 days. So by early January, the U.S. already saw a politically vulnerable adversary under acute financial strain. A week later, Treasury formalized the pressure in another direction. On January 15th, OFAC sanctioned what it called the architects of Iran's crackdown on peaceful demonstrators and, at the same time, targeted shadow banking networks tied to Bank Melli and Shar Bank. Treasury said those networks allowed elites to launder natural resource revenue through the formal international financial system rather than use it for the Iranian public. That matters because it shows the campaign was already operating on two tracks at once: pressure the regime and pressure the money. That January 15th release is important because it reveals how Treasury thinks about coercion. It was not only punishing security officials for repression, it was also going after the financial circuitry that lets sanctioned revenue keep moving through front companies, exchange houses, and offshore intermediaries. In other words, pressure on the regime and pressure on the money channels were already fused into a single campaign. Then came the quote that turned a technocratic policy into a political headline. On February 6th, during a Senate Banking Committee hearing, Bessent said Treasury had created a dollar shortage in Iran, and that the strategy culminated in December when one of the country's largest banks went under, the currency collapsed, inflation spiked, and people took to the streets. He was not speaking hypothetically, he was describing cause and effect. And that is where this story stops sounding financial and starts sounding openly strategic. Read that carefully, and the mechanism starts to come into focus. A dollar shortage in this context does not mean Treasury literally confiscated cash from wallets in Tehran. It means the U.S. squeezed foreign exchange inflows and intensified the difficulty of moving oil revenue and banking transactions through channels that touch the dollar system. Treasury's own January and February sanctions releases map out that architecture in detail. On February 25th, Treasury escalated again, sanctioning more than 30 individuals, entities, and vessels linked to Iranian petroleum sales, missile-related procurement, and what it called the shadow fleet. The release said these vessels and networks were part of Iran's primary revenue machinery for financing domestic repression, weapons activity, and regional proxies. Treasury also said more than 875 persons, vessels, and aircraft had been sanctioned in 2025 as part of this maximum pressure campaign. That is not symbolic enforcement, that is a systemic squeeze. That same month, Bessent gave the broader doctrinal justification. In a February 20th speech in Dallas, he said reserve currency status strengthens sanctions actions and reinforces American leadership in global finance. That line matters because it is the official admission of what serious observers already know. The dollar is not only a monetary asset for the United States, it is a coercive asset too. So, when Treasury talks about economic security, it is not speaking only about inflation, borrowing costs, or the health of the Treasury market. It is also talking about the state's ability to turn reserve currency dominance into policy leverage. That is why Treasury's sanctions policy and Treasury's defense of dollar primacy belong in the same conversation. They are two sides of the same geopolitical toolkit. By April, the campaign had become even more operational. Reuters reported on April 15th that Bessent told reporters the U.S. was willing to apply secondary sanctions against countries buying Iranian oil and against banks holding Iranian money. He specifically said Treasury had written to two Chinese banks and warned that if Iranian money was found flowing through their accounts, Washington was prepared to sanction them. That alone would be serious, but Treasury did not stop there. That same day, Treasury announced new sanctions on an illicit oil smuggling network tied to Mohammad Hossein Shamkhani, saying it was moving aggressively under economic fury and warning that financial institutions should expect Treasury to use all available tools, including secondary sanctions. The language was notable because it framed the action not as routine compliance enforcement, but as an offensive campaign. This was not just pressure, it was demonstration. Now look at the waiver story, because it exposes the mechanics of economic war better than any slogan could. Reuters reported that the Iranian waiver issued on March 20th allowed about 140 million barrels of oil to reach global markets and eased pressure on energy supply during the war. That means Washington was simultaneously prosecuting a pressure campaign against Iran and temporarily letting sanctioned Iranian barrels move when the market needed relief. That is the contradiction, and it is also the strategy. That is not policy incoherence. It is policy under constraint. The U.S. wanted to starve Tehran's revenue stream, but it also needed to avoid detonating an already stressed oil market. So Treasury used the waiver like a pressure release valve. Maximum pressure was the headline. Managed supply was the fine print. Then, on April 15th, Besant said both the Russian and Iranian general licenses would not be renewed. Reuters reported that the moves signaled an end to the administration's effort to use sanctions waivers to free up supply and lower soaring global energy prices. At that moment, the message from Washington looked clear. The cushioning phase was ending. The punitive phase was intensifying. But policy reality intervened almost immediately. On April 17th, Reuters reported that Washington renewed the Russian oil waiver for another month after pressure from Asian countries dealing with the Iran war price shock. The renewed waiver explicitly excluded Iran, Cuba, and North Korea. That distinction matters. It shows Washington still wanted the economic squeeze on Tehran, but not at the cost of completely losing its remaining supply buffers. That reversal tells you what total economic war really looks like in practice. It is not pure economic annihilation with no regard for collateral effects. It is calibrated coercion inside a live global market. Treasury can punish, exempt, reverse, and retighten. It is not simply trying to destroy flows. It is trying to decide which flows are tolerable, which are not, and when the political cost of a price spike becomes too high. That is the real operating logic of the system. So, what do you call this? Smart economic warfare, or proof that even American power has hard limits? Drop dollar if you think this is strategic control, or oil if you think the market is still setting the boundaries. Secondary sanctions are the sharpest part of that system because they widen the zone of fear. The United States does not need to seize every Iranian cargo directly if it can make banks, traders, insurers, and counterparties decide on their own that touching Iranian money is not worth the risk. Once that happens, the private sector begins enforcing the campaign for Washington. And that is when state power gets multiplied by private caution. That is why the April 15th Reuters report matters so much. Besant was not just threatening Tehran. He was threatening everyone around Tehran, buyers, banks, and institutions holding Iranian funds. He specifically linked the maritime blockade and the secondary sanctions threat, saying the U.S. believed Chinese buying would pause under those conditions. That is classic financial statecraft. Pressure the node, then frighten the network around it. Treasury's own releases fill in the commercial map. January's action targeted rahbar companies, cover firms, and exchange house-style structures used to manage foreign transactions. February's action targeted vessels, owners, and intermediaries in Iran's shadow fleet. April's action went after another oil smuggling network and again warned institutions about secondary sanctions. This is not one sanction. It is a layered campaign against the system that converts oil into usable money. And notice how broad the jurisdictional picture is. Reuters said Treasury had sent warning letters not only to Chinese banks, but also to banks or jurisdictions tied to activity in China, Hong Kong, the UAE, and Oman. Treasury's own sanctions releases name entities and vessels across multiple flags and offshore structures. That is what modern economic warfare looks like. A web, not a border. There is also an institutional message in all of this. In Dallas, Besant said, the dollar's reserve currency role anchors borrowing costs, deepens capital markets, and strengthens sanctions actions. That statement is almost a doctrine in itself. It says the same system that finances American deficits and stabilizes Treasury markets also enlarges Washington's ability to punish adversaries through global finance. Power and plumbing are fused. But that power is not free. The more openly Washington presents the dollar system as a coercive instrument, the more every non-aligned state has an incentive to ask a simple question: what happens if we are next? That does not mean the dollar collapses tomorrow. It does mean the demonstration effect grows every time Treasury boasts about using financial scarcity as a weapon. That is why overstatement would be a mistake. The script is not that the dollar order is about to die. The script is that Washington is showing, with unusual candor, how much strategic leverage the existing order still gives it. And each public display of that leverage increases the incentive for others to hedge over time, even if they cannot replace the system anytime soon. That is the longer shadow of this strategy. Here is the core contradiction in one line. Treasury is publicly advertising its ability to create scarcity in an adversary's financial system, while privately and publicly carving out exceptions to prevent the global market shock from spiraling out of control. That is not hypocrisy. It is the operating logic of economic war conducted by the issuer of the reserve currency. Punish hard, but not so hard that the market punishes you back. This is why the Treasury Department increasingly functions like a strategic command node, even though it is not a military agency. It controls sanctions design, licensing, financial warnings, and the legal authorities that determine who can touch what money and at what cost. In a conflict where oil, banks, and shipping matter as much as missiles, that is enormous power. Treasury is not just adjacent to modern conflict, it helps shape its boundaries. And the sophistication has increased. The old sanctions stereotype was a blunt embargo. The newer model is much more modular: target shadow fleets, target laundering channels, target regime-linked elites, warn foreign banks, allow temporary waivers, then revoke or renew them depending on market conditions. That approach is harder to headline, but strategically, it is more agile. It also lets Washington manage escalation. If the goal were simply to stop every molecule of sanctioned oil immediately, the policy would be easier to describe and much harder to sustain. By contrast, a system of pressure plus exemptions allows Treasury to say it is tightening the vice while still retaining room to adapt when prices, allies, or elections make rigidity expensive. The Russian waiver reversal is the cleanest proof of that. And yes, domestic politics are part of the picture. Reuters reported that high oil prices were a threat to Trump's Republicans ahead of the November midterms, and that partner countries pushed hard for the Russian waiver extension. So even a campaign sold as strategic necessity still has to survive gasoline prices, allied pressure, and the calendar. Economic war is never conducted in a vacuum. It always has to survive voters. That means the strongest version of this theme is not, Washington can crash any economy it wants, whenever it wants. That would be sloppy. The stronger and more defensible claim is that the United States can create extraordinary pressure by exploiting the world's dependence on dollar-linked finance and commodity settlement. But the more integrated the target is with energy markets, the more that coercion rebounds into the global system Washington also has to manage. That is strength and constraint at the same time. The Iran case makes that trade-off visible. Treasury's January and February actions show steady tightening of shadow banking and shadow fleet pressure. Besant's February hearing remarks show unusual confidence in the impact of that pressure. But the March and April waiver story shows that once the war and oil shock intensified, Washington itself had to bend some of the rules to keep the market functioning. That is the real lesson. Not that the weapon failed, but that even powerful weapons impose costs on the hand using them. If this breakdown is helping you see how power actually moves through the financial system, subscribe to Signal Drop and drop $1 in the comments. Because the real story here is not one sanctions package. It is that modern conflict can be fought through licenses, bank warnings, shipping designations, and reserve currency power just as surely as through weapons. The hidden cost is strategic imitation. Every time Washington demonstrates that access to the dollar system can be narrowed for political effect, more countries look for ways to reduce single point dependence. That can mean alternative payment channels, regional financing ties, more barter style commodity relationships, or simply a greater tolerance for redundancy and inefficiency in exchange for autonomy. Hedging becomes a security policy. And you can already see the mood changing. Reuters reported from the IMF and World Bank meetings that finance leaders are grappling with repeated geopolitical shocks and a growing realization that counting on U.S. leadership to resolve crises is no longer the guarantee it had once been. Officials were effectively watching Tehran and the White House because that was where the real economic decisions were being made. That is a remarkable admission of where power now sits and of how openly that power is now being used. So, what should we watch next? First, whether the Iranian waiver remains expired while the Russian waiver remains flexible. That split would tell us Washington still sees Tehran as the primary revenue target, even while it keeps some non-Iranian barrels flowing to calm prices. The shape of the exemptions is often more revealing than the rhetoric around them, because exemptions tell you where power meets limitation. Second, watch the banks, not just the tankers. Treasury's April warning to foreign buyers and institutions means the next phase of pressure may be less about dramatic seizures and more about whether counterparties decide the compliance risk is no longer worth the revenue. When banks step back, the rest of the network usually tightens fast. And when the network tightens, the effects spread further than a single shipment ever could. Third, keep the internal Iranian picture in focus. Reuters' January reporting and Treasury's own January release both point to a country already under heavy economic and political stress, shaped by sanctions, mismanagement, repression, and public anger. If instability deepens again, Washington will almost certainly claim that maximum pressure is working. But the truth will still be layered, not monocausal. Economic pressure can intensify collapse without being the only cause of it. Fourth, watch the allies and major importers. The Russian waiver reversal happened after pressure from countries dealing with the energy shock. Reuters reporting from Washington shows how frustrated finance ministers have become with being dragged through another crisis shaped by decisions made outside their control. If the U.S. keeps using financial pressure this openly, allies may comply. But they will also adapt. And over time, adaptation becomes strategy. That is the real meaning of the engineered collapse story. It is not that tanks were replaced by spreadsheets or that sanctions made war obsolete. It is that in 2026, some of the most consequential blows are being delivered from office buildings in Washington through the systems that price oil, move money, and decide who gets to stay connected to the world economy. Treasury is not just funding power, it is exercising it.